Mounting criticism has been lobbed at Israel for impeding aid from getting to Gaza, but the U.S. has found a workaround, a floating pier for the Gaza Strip. Per the Associated Press, the American military completed the pier project Thursday, just over 2 months after President Biden ordered its construction. Badly needed humanitarian aid can now get to the enclave, providing some relief to the 600,000 people who have been displaced.
Critique over Israel's bloody campaign in Gaza has manifested in global community condemnation, worldwide protest, and even rebuke coming from within Israel. Per reports, frustrations are growing in Israel because of a lack of a plan for a post-war Gaza. Now, Israeli Defense Minister Yoav Gallant on Wednesday accused Israel's war cabinet of ignoring his queries about a replacement for Hamas rule in Gaza, publicly bucking Prime Minister Netanyahu in a speech broadcasted live on Wednesday, in which he said, quote, "The day after Hamas strategy will not work if no alternative is set to replace Hamas." Now, in response to what might be seen as a reasonable question about next steps, several Israeli coalition members and government ministers called on him to be dismissed. Right-wing National Security Minister Ben-Gvir slammed Gallant, saying that from his point of view, quote, "There is no difference between whether the IDF soldiers control Gaza or whether Hamas murderers control it." Gallant's criticism comes as reports of friendly fire killed 5 Israeli Defense Forces soldiers. Per the Israeli military, the 5 soldiers were slain by their own military and 7 others were injured after an IDF tank shelled a building where they mistakenly thought enemy forces were. The deaths bring the total of slain IDF troops on the ground in Gaza to 278. Yeah, it's obviously tragic that this has happened. Notably, this isn't the first time that we've had one of these friendly fire incidents. In fact, NPR wrote up a piece back in January looking into why such a high number of Israeli soldiers in Gaza have died by friendly fire. Nearly 1/5 of all Israeli deaths have happened this way. And I do think it's worth reflecting on whether or not that high incidence rate of friendly fire deaths has some relationship to what has been described as an indiscriminate bombing campaign.
And it's certainly something to worry about and keep in mind as this pier has been built that we've have promises and assurances does not actually involve American troops. Yeah. But of course, aid workers have the food relief, the Jose Andres people who got killed wrongly by the IDF. So there's somebody is going to be there dispersing this aid. My understanding is it's going to be coordinated by the United Nations. I mean, I would also ask the question of why it was the U.S.'s obligation to build it in the first place. It feels a lot to me like paying to build things we've blown up, or like because we paid for this stuff to the entrances to be destroyed and the building to be destroyed, and we're creating a starvation problem here, and now we're paying to bring in aid. That seems exactly like the kind of thing that I can't speak for all American voters, but all American taxpayers might look skeptically at funding both sides of this conflict.
Yeah, there are 7 border crossings into Gaza. 7. And so we're in a position where we're saying we're in cooperation with the Israeli government. They're not doing collective punishment. We've seen at all of these State Department briefings that there is a reluctance, a refusal, I would say, to acknowledge that there is aid being withheld, even as we're looking with our eyes at Israeli troops standing by, not intervening when Israeli civilians are videotaped throwing aid off of trucks into the median. And so the question remains, if this is our ally and if we are working not at cross purposes but together as allies should, why is it that Israel isn't able to get aid in on trucks through any of those gates? And why is it that America now has to build an entire new form of infrastructure, a pier, because Israel cannot, for whatever reason, get aid through the border crossings that already exist? One other point, just to, I think, that reflects how intense
We can build things, just not in this country.
Right. One of them that reflects
it would take 18 years to do enough paperwork.
Sure. But that reflects the kind of gravity and the extremity of the Israeli government right now is that Yoav Gallant is no left-wing figure. He is very much a part of the very conservative, party that is running the Israeli government. He simply has raised the question of what we do after Hamas is defeated, whatever that means. What we do the next day, who's going to be in power in Gaza. And there are now calls for his resignation, calls for him to be fired, simply for raising that as a question. And so it really, I do think, again, if America is Israel's partner in all of this, what does it mean for us to be coordinating with a government that doesn't even want to reflect on what happens to the people of Gaza the day after? And is that because there is no day after in the plan of some of these extremists that are in Israel's government? Is the plan actually to do what so many members of the Israeli cabinet have said that they were going to do earlier this week during this kind of march to Gaza and conference that they had, to resettle Gaza by Israelis and to permanently expel all of the 2.3 million people who are living in Gaza from the territory?
Let's get to our next story. Now, many have shuddered at the thought of labeling Israel's campaign in Gaza as a genocide, but with over 35,000 people killed in Gaza in the war against Hamas, a growing chorus of critics warming up to calling it just that, genocide. Human rights activist Arya Nir penned an op-ed in the New York Review explaining that while he believes Israel has a right to defend itself against Hamas and the horrific October 7th attack on Israel, Netanyahu's indiscriminate shelling of Gaza is unacceptable. He points out that while it's difficult to go up against an enemy dressed in plain clothes like any other civilian, he writes, quote, "I am now persuaded that Israel is engaged in genocide against Palestinians in Gaza. What has changed my mind is its sustained policy of obstructing the movement of humanitarian assistance into the territory."
Yeah, that's really tough. So as some background, this is someone who is a founder of Human Rights Watch. He has been, up until this point, kind of skeptical about claims of genocide in Israel. I believe he was a Holocaust survivor himself. And so this like kind of change of attitude has really, I think, demonstrated how serious what's going on the ground there is. He's someone who's seen as a very credible interlocutor on this issue, someone who, believes that Hamas's way of conducting warfare is not, right and good. He alludes to the idea of Hamas hiding among civilians and all of those kinds of things. And he says, and yet even believing this, I am now persuaded that Israel is engaged in genocide in Palestine. And he really points to the kind of the collective punishment point, which I gotta say, people have been making since the beginning, because again, Yoav Gallant, remember him? We were talking about him a little bit earlier. He's the one that said outright, we are going to collectively punish Gaza by denying them food and water. It was said so explicitly early on. That is why you have the ICJ saying there is this plausible grounds for genocide and the intent for genocide, which is usually the hardest part to prove. And so many people pushed back against that. So many people said, this is premature. Israel has a right to defend itself. It doesn't matter how it goes about doing that. We're going to ignore international law. It doesn't matter if there are Israeli leaders clearly saying that they are going to violate international law. We should stand by for now 7 months and allow Israel to do this. And what's really galling about this, Ryan Grimm interviewed one of the doctors who's been trying to save lives in Gaza yesterday, and she pointed out that there are a number of people that are treated on a daily basis who die from things that are preventable because they don't have the ability to access the medical care. She says that there are people who are dying because they don't have diabetes medication. There are people, she treated a grandmother who died from an untreated UTI. People are dying, and those kind of deaths aren't necessarily even being attributed to Israel. And when we're looking at these death numbers that have now been, by the way, stagnated at 35,000 now for months, precisely because there's not the personnel to keep track of the deaths, and because the deaths are happening in so many disparate ways that aren't directly attributed to a bomb, but can be directly attributed to the failure to let aid into Gaza.
Well, we'll continue to follow that. More Rising right after this.